When I first heard that King Charles III had decided to travel to Mecca, I didn't believe it. Not because he couldn't, but because I never pictured a man born into palaces, wrapped in titles and ceremony, choosing to walk into a place where every soul stands equal before God. But that's exactly what he did. And let me tell you something. That decision alone spoke more about humility than any royal decree ever could. I've watched many powerful people hide behind their excuses. But when I saw Charles preparing for this journey, I saw something rare in men of his stature. Sincerity. There were no cameras, no PR handlers, no speeches about goodwill. It was quiet, private, almost sacred. They say he had been studying Islam privately for years, reading the Quran in silence, visiting scholars, asking questions that shook him more than the answers did. One evening, after a long walk through his gardens in Scotland, he turned to his aide and said something that changed everything. If truth is one, then I need to see Mecca where 1 billion people bow to it. That's how it began, not as a political gesture, but as a personal search. I imagine him standing by his window that night, looking at the stars, realizing that titles, crowns, and history mean nothing when your soul is restless. You can rule nations, and still lose yourself if you don't rule your heart. So he made the arrangements quietly, respectfully, through the right channels. Because Mecca isn't a tourist destination, it's sacred ground. And for someone like King Charles to step there meant crossing the boundaries of privilege, entering a realm where his name carried no weight. I heard he was nervous. And believe me, you don't approach holiness without trembling a little. On the day he departed, London was grey, the kind of sky that reminds you how small you are under heaven. His entourage was stripped down to the essentials. No velvet, no metals, just simple clothing, and a face carrying questions more than answers. When the plane touched down in Saudi Arabia, something inside him shifted. Witnesses said he didn't speak for hours, just stared out the window as the desert stretched, endless and golden, a horizon so ancient it made Buckingham Palace feel like a recent rumor. I can almost hear his thoughts. All my life I've been bowed to. Now it's my turn to bow. Because the first footsteps in Mecca aren't just steps, they're confessions. Every pilgrim carries a weight. And Charles carried centuries of kingship, empire and ego. But Mecca cares not for lineage. It asks only, what's in your heart? When he entered the holy city dressed in the simple white cloth of Ihram, the uniform of equality, there were no guards, no trumpets, no signs of royalty. Just the hum of prayers rising from every direction. They say he looked around like a man seeing the world anew. His eyes wet, his lips trembling, his posture unsure, as if the crown had suddenly grown heavy with a meaning he never knew before. Judge all you will, but in that moment Charles wasn't the monarch. He was a man stripped to his essence. He watched the pilgrims moving around the Kaaba, thousands circling in unison, chanting words older than any kingdom. And I think he realized, true power doesn't come from control, comes from surrender. I've seen humility rehearsed, but this was different. His aide said he kept whispering, "It's alive. This place is alive." Maybe for the first time he felt what it means to belong to something eternal. I can imagine his hands trembling as he lifted them in prayer, not knowing all the words, yet feeling them all the same. The gratitude, the guilt, the awe. When you watch a man who's lived above others finally look up to something higher, you're witnessing justice in its purest form. This journey wasn't about religion, it was about revelation. Every monarch is taught to hold the world. Mecca teaches you to let go of it. As he walked the marble floors under the blazing sun, surrounded by millions dressed just like him, his titles melted away. There was no "Your Majesty," only "Brother." You could see it in his face, that strange mix of confusion and peace, like a man finally meeting his own soul after decades of separation. He stopped before the Kaaba, and there he didn't move for a long time. He just stood, breathing, absorbing, remembering. Some say he wept. I believe it. Because when truth hits, it doesn't ask permission, just breaks you open. And between those tears and those prayers, Charles began to understand something no crown had ever taught him. That greatness isn't measured by what you rule. It's measured by what you revere. People talk about leadership and legacy. I think he found both on that pilgrimage. Not in speeches or monuments, but in silence. In the sound of millions whispering. Here I am. O Lord, here I am. I can almost hear a voice, sharp and unwavering, saying, finally, a king who learned how to kneel. And that's the truth. Because before you can lead men, you must learn to follow truth. And that is exactly what Mecca teaches, stripping away every illusion until what remains is sincerity. By the time he left that courtyard, he wasn't the same man who landed days earlier. The cameras weren't rolling, but heaven was watching. And if you ask me, that's the real audience that matters. His wasn't just King Charles's journey. It was humanity's reminder that faith isn't inherited, it's discovered. And discovery begins when pride ends. When I tell you what he saw inside Mecca, understand this wasn't a royal tour or spiritual sightseeing trip. This was the confrontation between ego and eternity. From the moment he stepped onto the marble of the Grand Mosque, you could almost feel centuries peeling off his shoulders. The sound alone, the rhythmic hum of a million voices, the echo of the adhan cutting through the desert air, shook him in ways no cathedral ever could. A man who's been bowed to his whole life standing among people who bow only to God. Now that's a collision no crown prepares you for. He stood among every race, every language, every face equal in that sea of white cloth. And I imagine, he finally understood what equality truly means. You can pass laws on diversity, hold conferences on unity. All of it. But you'll never understand it until you've seen people crying beside strangers circling a house not of gold or glass, but devotion. They say, Charles whispered, so this is surrender. And I think that's when he truly understood the word. Because surrender isn't weakness. It's wisdom. It's a moment you realize. Control is an illusion. Faith is the only real anchor in a storm. I've seen men pretend reverence, but he didn't. He touched the Kaaba like a man touching truth. Gently, fearfully, gratefully. I imagine him thinking of his ancestors, the empire, the wars fought in God's name, and for a fleeting moment wondering, was it all worth it? Because when you're standing before that sacred cube, history seems smaller than a grain of sand. Mecca humbles you. It breaks the false mirrors we build for ourselves. King Charles watched people weeping on marble, hands raised, voices trembling with prayers saved for a lifetime, and it got to him. One of his guards later said he saw him sit down quietly in a corner. No throne, no servants. Just Charles, just a man whispering, this is the real kingdom. Faith doesn't care how high your walls are. Finds you anyway. Later he met an old pilgrim from Nigeria who walked barefoot just to reach that place. The man didn't know who Charles was. When someone told him, he laughed and said, before God, we're all the same, my son. That one sentence hit the king harder than any royal lecture. I imagine that voice again saying, now that is divine justice, the kind you don't appeal, the kind that changes you from the inside out. And they would be right, because that is exactly what happened. Every call to prayer became a reminder that time doesn't belong to kings. It belongs to the Creator. 5 times a day he paused, he sat still. He listened as millions aligned with one purpose. No meetings, no luxury, no distractions. Just pure synchronization between body, soul and heaven. That rhythm seeps in. It rearranges your heartbeat. He told one scholar later. It felt like the entire world was exhaling in peace. Then came Medina. If Mecca is flame, Medina is light. They say Charles entered with tears still drying on his cheeks. The air there is different, softer, almost kind. You feel it the moment you arrive. The Mosque of Al-Masjid an-Nabawi stands not in grandeur, but in grace. And even someone unfamiliar with its history can sense the sanctity that lives in its silence. Charles sat in that mosque, hands clasped, eyes fixed on men reading the Quran, children learning verses, elders whispering prayers. And I'll tell you, for a man schooled in protocol and hierarchy to sit shoulder to shoulder with laborers, farmers, teachers, beggars, it rewires your understanding of worth. He wasn't King Charles there. He was just another soul seeking connection. one scholar said. The king kept repeating, "There's peace here, not the kind you negotiate, the kind you feel." And that right there is what Medina gives. It's not a lecture. It's a lullaby for the heart. In Mecca your ego burns. In Medina your soul heals. That's the balance that Islam has held for 1,000 years. Fire and mercy. Discipline and compassion. Justice and love. Charles walked the corridors where the Prophet once walked. He watched people feeding strangers, helping the elderly, teaching children to recite God's words. And I think something inside him cracked. Not in pain but in awakening. Because for the first time he wasn't being served. He was serving something greater. I'm told he even joined handing out food one night to pilgrims, wearing a simple cloak. No guards in sight. Nobody recognized him. They just saw another man helping, smiling, saying, "Peace be upon you," like everyone else. Maybe that anonymity felt like freedom, the kind no palace could ever offer. When he finally stood before the Prophet's resting place, he didn't speak for a long time. He just stood, eyes closed, lips moving silently. Some say he prayed. Some say he wept. But what I know is this. When he walked out of that mosque his face had changed. It wasn't exhaustion or emotion. It was the look of someone who's finally found what he's been searching for his entire life. And you know what? That's what faith does. It finds you in the noise, holds you still and says, "You belong." I can almost hear that voice again, sharp, direct. Divine order. Because after all the pomp, all the argument, the truth doesn't need a judge. Proves itself. Charles's journey through Mecca and Medina wasn't about conversion. It wasn't about politics. It was about the collision between what he was taught and what he felt, between a lifetime of duty and a moment of divine honesty. And once you experience that, you don't go back the same. You can't. Because once your heart hears the call, silence anywhere else sounds hollow. When King Charles returned from his pilgrimage, the world expected a press conference, a statement, some royal words polished and delivered. But what they got instead was silence, the kind that speaks louder than speeches. I can almost hear the voice again. Sometimes silence is the only honest testimony. And it would be right, because the man who stepped back onto British soil wasn't the same man who left it. The photographers noticed it before anyone else. His eyes no longer carried the weight of ceremony. They carried the calm of someone who stood in front of truth and let it rewrite him. The palace walls, once symbols of grandeur, now felt like echo chambers of noise. He walked slower, spoke softer. And when his staff asked about the trip, he simply said, "It was not a trip. It was a trial, and I passed only by grace." That is the thing about encounters with the divine. They strip you down. They show you how small you are, and how merciful the universe remains. From the moment he returned he started spending more time in reflection. Fewer banquets, more books, fewer applause, more prayer. He began inviting scholars, imams, priests and rabbis to the same table, not for diplomacy, but for dialogue. And for once it didn't look like politics. It looked like peace in action. I imagine that voice at the end. After all the titles and tributes, the only verdict that matters is, has a man learned humility? It would pause, look straight into the camera, and let the weight settle. Because Charles had learned humility, not the kind you rehearse, but the kind you earn through tears, heat and miles walked in devotion. He began supporting humanitarian projects quietly in the Middle East. No headlines, no publicists. They say he donated anonymously to rebuild homes near the desert towns where pilgrims rest. And every night he'd read passages from the Quran beside his Bible, not as contradiction but continuation. Because he didn't come back to declare conversion. He returned to declare comprehension, that God's mercy is bigger than the walls we build around his name. The British press tried to analyze his calm. The tabloids called it a spiritual shift. But I'd call it what that voice would say. Divine justice. The kind you don't appeal. The kind that changes you from the inside out. His children noticed it too. They said he laughed more often, hugged longer. And when he spoke of leadership he spoke of service. not sovereignty. That's the paradox of faith. The higher you rise in humility, the freer you become. Mecca had burned the arrogance. Medina filled the ashes with mercy. Now back home he carried both fire and light within him. During a public address he said quietly, "I've seen a world where every man is equal before his Creator, and I wish that spirit to live in us all." It wasn't royal rhetoric. It was revelation. People didn't clap right away. They listened because sincerity has a sound. And once you've heard it, you cannot mistake it for anything else. The world, in its noise and conflict, needed that reminder. Faith isn't a costume. It's a compass. And Charles found his true north, not in Buckingham Palace, but in the desert of Mecca. That voice would finish with a verdict. It takes courage to face a courtroom, but it takes divine courage to face your own soul. And that's exactly what he did. Because at the end of every story, every trial, every journey, there is one undeniable fact: truth transforms. King Charles's truth wasn't written in royal decrees. It was written in the sand, in the prayers, in the tears of a man who saw what real equality looks like under the same sky that covers us all. His pilgrimage wasn't a royal chapter. It was a human confession, because even kings need saving. And so he carried that lesson quietly, letting his actions do the preaching. The world may forget his speeches, but it will never forget the sight of a monarch who bowed his head not before men, but before God. And if that voice were to end this story, it would close the book, lean back and say with unmistakable conviction, "Ladies and gentlemen, that is the justice of the soul." And there is no appeal after that.